When we think of political campaign slogans, we often think of catchy one-liners, usually with a positive tone. However, positive was not the tone the infamous Liberian warlord Charles Taylor sought to achieve with his 1997 presidential campaign slogan, but rather more of a scare tactic approach with his infamous, "He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I will vote for him." Today, we're going to be looking at what happens when a Liberian warlord is an ultra-charismatic, media-savvy megalomaniac whose thirst for power is only rivaled by his knack for destabilizing West African countries.
Not a military coup, not a military situation. Ordinary people uprising, trying to bring fair play and justice. We'll kill him. If he doesn't give himself up, which means that he wants to fight, we'll kill him.
Charles Taylor has no right to ask my resignation. So to answer your question, I'm not going to resign.
There's been a lot of trouble in the Liberian capital, Monrovia, over the weekend. People came out onto the streets on Saturday and Sunday and went on the rampage. Tear gas was used by the police to try and disperse the crowds. They opened fire, and a number of people have been killed and injured. And Monrovia has been put under a nighttime curfew.
It's a day of utter confusion in Liberia. This morning, in the wake of the much-disputed general elections, dubbed rigged by the opposition, Liberian radio announced that there'd been a coup. General Kyenkyen, once Mdou's right-hand man, was accused of plotting a coup in 1983 and fled the country to the United States.
They are announcing again that the coup has failed. They say they are in complete command of the armed forces of Liberia.
Liberia announces immediate trials in the wake of the coup attempt. The coup leader, General Kyenkyen, was captured and killed. A lot of opposition leaders are detained.
President Samuel Mdou, in a nationwide broadcast this evening, disclosed that on Christmas Eve, a group of dissidents from Liberia entered the country from Côte d'Ivoire by way of Mdou in Nimba County, launched an attack on security personnel at the border. The president said the dissidents shot and killed Staff Sergeant Jeffrey McCarthy at Mdou. Master Sergeant Thomas Coker was also shot and wounded and is presently undergoing treatment at a local hospital. A rebel flag is still flying over the Liberian village where an uprising began 2 weeks ago against President Samuel Mdou, refugees say. They told Reuters they had seen the flag, a scorpion on a red background, 2 days ago in Mdou, a deserted and devastated border village in Liberia where they said bodies were lying in the streets, being eaten by pigs and dogs. Government troops burned most houses in the village and killed the senior administrator and his wife, village chief Dennis Say said.
The latest round of Liberian peace talks in Abuja ended in failure.
Charles Taylor was born in Arlington, Liberia in 1948. His father was part of the minority Americo-Liberians, elites descended from the freed slaves who migrated from America and founded the country. They dominated the country's politics for over a century, marginalized the many native ethnic groups, as well as being the most wealthy part of the population, despite being a small minority. This led to long-standing tensions between Americo-Liberians and other native ethnic groups. His mother was Gola, one of the many indigenous African ethnicities that make up a majority of the country's population. However, Taylor did not speak the indigenous language of the Gola, nor practice their traditional religious values. Taylor's upbringing in Liberia was comparatively privileged, with his dad working as a lawyer and a judge, amongst other roles. Taylor would eventually be expelled from a private prep school in Liberia when he was a teenager, foreshadowing his love for rules and tendency to abide by them. Taylor worked as a teacher and later a junior accountant in the government. However, Taylor wanted to leave Liberia for the United States to pursue his education. Taylor ended up heading to study at Bentley University in Massachusetts, graduating with a degree in economics in 1977. Whilst there, Taylor joined the Union of Liberian Associations, quickly rising to become the national chairman of the organization. In 1979, then Liberian President William Tolbert was visiting the United States, and Taylor led a protest against Tolbert's policies outside the Liberian mission in New York City. Tolbert invited Taylor to a debate, in which his impressive oratory skills were on full display. Tolbert seeing the potential value in Taylor, invited him back to Liberia. Taylor arrived back in Liberia in spring of 1980, and within a few months, President Tolbert was overthrown and killed in a brutal coup d'etat led by Master Sergeant Samuel Doe. Members of the Tolbert government were executed after being found guilty in a kangaroo court, with some infamously being brought to a beach in downtown Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, and were executed by firing squad in front of news cameras for the world to see.
When a group of military officers raided the executive mansion of President William Tolbert, Liberia experienced the first coup d'etat of its 133-year-old history. The military tribunal tried 13 government officials of the Tolbert regime. All of them were found guilty and condemned to death by a firing squad. A public execution was to be staged on the beachfront of Monrovia, Liberia's capital city. The Liberian people were eager for the executions to begin. The sooner Tolbert's men were shot, the sooner their country could enter an era of civilian rule.
Importantly, this coup ended centuries of Americo-Liberian political domination, as Doe became the first indigenous Liberian president. Taylor conducted political maneuvering, leading to him being appointed as the head of the General Services Agency, making him one of only 2 non-indigenous Liberians within Doe's political cabinet. Taylor would have to flee Liberia in 1983, however, after being caught embezzling over $900,000 US to a Citibank account. Taylor was arrested in the US in 1984 following Doe's government issuing an international arrest warrant. Taylor was held at Plymouth House Correctional Jail whilst the US government was contemplating whether or not to extradite him, knowing that Doe would most likely have him executed upon returning to Liberia. Would Taylor wait around for that decision to come through? Of course not. Taylor broke out of prison and headed to Africa. Quick bit of extra info. Taylor would have been extra aware of what happened to people Doe did not view favorably, as in 1985 there was a failed coup led by General Thomas Kwankpa, who had previously been a close ally of Doe. After the coup failed, the general was captured and he was mutilated and partially eaten by General Doe's men, believing it would allow them to assume the strength of the enemy, and later they put his mangled body on display for the public to see. After fleeing both America and Liberia, Taylor decided he wanted to start a revolution, and to do that, he would tour the African continent, making connections, getting training, supplies, and recruiting. At some point during his tour, Taylor either co-founded or joined and became the head of the military wing of the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPFL, with which he would rise to power. Taylor stopped in multiple countries, using his charisma to gain the backing of multiple African heads of state. His stops on his tour included Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi provided him with supplies and military training. Importantly, Gaddafi also introduced him to the leaders of Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire. In Burkina Faso, he began training, organizing, and was also lent troops by the government. And in Côte d'Ivoire, he and his rebels would organize and prepare to launch an invasion of Liberia. On the 24th of December, 1989, Charles Taylor and 168 NPFL fighters crossed the border from Côte d'Ivoire into Liberia, looking to remove Samuel Doe from office and install Taylor as president, declaring, "The best Doe is a dead Doe." By this time, Taylor was head honcho of the NPFL and was responsible for making all the decisions. The group initially headed into Nimba County, knowing that the 2 majority ethnic groups there, Guios and Manos, were typically anti the Doe government, and also much of the Liberian contingent in the organization was Guio, something which Taylor hoped he could play upon to recruit. 2 days into the invasion, Taylor decided to call the BBC's Focus on Africa program to announce his invasion and plans. Taylor's charisma and uniqueness made him a repeat guest and would create some infamous moments. Initially, recruitment was slow and progress declined as a result. However, this was soon to change. In a delayed response, Doe sent in the Liberian military to the region, which had become increasingly more representative of the Kron and Mandingo's ethnic group, with the former being Does. The military conducted a campaign of terror against the local population, looting, raping, and killing, especially targeting people of the Gios and Manos ethnic group. This forced many Gios and Manos to align with Taylor's MPFL and led to recruitment skyrocketing, including many children orphaned by the violence. This made the organization increasingly more representative of the two specific ethnic groups. This was all despite Taylor not caring about the ethnic nature of the fighting outside of how he could benefit from it. This ethnic factionalism led to continuous retaliatory attacks as a result. As the MPFL advanced into regions populated by Krons and Mandingos, they raped, pillaged, and killed. The Liberian army did the same. During all this, though, Taylor tried to carefully craft his persona to broaden his appeal and increase recruitment. He changed his middle name from the Americo-Liberian sounding MacArthur to the Gola name Gonki. He started appearing in traditional attire and carrying around a chieftain's stick, giving himself the title Dakpana, meaning the most senior chief. By May 1990, Taylor's forces were in control of a majority of the country and were ready to head to the capital, Monrovia. In June of 1990, Taylor's position was looking extremely strong. His troops were closing in on Monrovia, and Doe's beleaguered government troops were losing ground. But the face of the conflict would change, following one of Taylor's key commanders, Prince Johnson, splitting from the organization for reasons that remain unclear. Johnson was a career soldier in Liberia before fleeing the country after being involved in Kwankwa's 1985 coup attempt and joining the MPFL. When Johnson, who is a Gio, split from the organization, he took many of the highly trained Gio soldiers with him, significantly decreasing Taylor's strength. Johnson's new group, the creatively named Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, kept the goal of overthrowing Doe's government, though wanted to prevent Taylor from gaining power. Johnson was well known for his tendencies to engage in casual killings and is often viewed as an alcoholic sociopath. In his rebel group, he was known for his violent physical discipline that he often enforced, and close overseeing of his men, leading to paranoia within the organization. In July of 1990, rebel forces were in the suburbs of Monrovia, and the city was starting to descend into anarchy. Food, water, and medicine were all suffering from shortages, and disease was prevalent. Soldiers in stolen vehicles roamed around, killing at random and looting. Dead bodies were dumped on the streets and not picked up due to fear of being labeled a rebel if caught doing so. Horrendous trails of violence were left behind by all forces. One particular notorious occurrence during this period was the St. Peter's Lutheran Church massacre. The church was housing 1,500 refugees, most of which were Gios and Manos, sheltering due to violent reprisals by Doe's army. The building had huge Red Cross flags flying at each corner of the compound it was in. On the night of July 29th, government soldiers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Tilley, came over the wall and started killing those inside, shooting and hacking to death men, women, children, and even babies. The next day, a Guinean doctor entered the church, where she found dead bodies sprawled throughout. She was only alerted to there still being life when a baby started crying. After comforting the baby, children who had survived protected by their parents' dead bodies appeared. Over 600 were killed in this single act of violence. In August, ministers from the region's economic bloc, ECOWAS, decided to create an intervention force called the Economic Community of West African States Monitoring Group, ECOMOG. Their justification was stated as due to the fact that thousands of nationals from their own respective countries were trapped in Liberia and refugees were fleeing to neighboring states, the conflict was no longer an internal matter. ECOMOG's mandate was to impose a ceasefire, help form an interim government, and hold elections within 12 months. The initial peacekeeping force was 4,000 soldiers strong, with the majority coming from Nigeria, and led by Ghanaian General Arnold Quainu. Other personnel that formed the force were from the Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Mali. The ECOMOG intervention was agreed to by Johnson's IMPFL and Ndou's government. However, Taylor's MPFL did not want ECOMOG there. The forces landed in the free port of Monrovia in late August and quickly established a headquarters for operations, though they remained limited at first. The city was still under siege, and neighborhood-to-neighborhood fighting was commonplace between the MPFL, IMPFL, and the Liberian government army, making mounting any serious operations difficult. However, on September 9th, Samuel Doe left his presidential mansion and headed to the ECOMOG headquarters for an unannounced visit with his convoy. Hearing that the president was in the area, Prince Johnson and his forces scrambled to confront him. Doe's soldiers and Johnson's rebels met each other at the ECOMOG headquarters and began shooting back and forth. In the ensuing violence, 70 were killed, and Doe was captured by Johnson's men and taken away. Questions were later asked of how Doe was captured whilst at the ECOMOG headquarters, with many regarding ECOMOG as being complicit in his capture due to viewing him as a hindrance to long-term peace in Liberia. In one of the most infamous parts of Liberian history, following Doe's capture, Johnson and his men brutally tortured him, even recording some of it on camera. A grainy video with poor audio shows Doe bloodied and beaten, begging for mercy in front of Johnson, who calmly sips on a beer while his men laugh. Later on in the video, Doe has an ear severed by Johnson's men. Typically, when a war crime is committed, the perpetrators will try to hide the evidence. However, not in this case. Johnson made copies of the video and shared it to reporters for the video to be shared around. The shocking nature of the video brought substantial attention to Liberia. During this time, ECOWAS helped to form an interim Liberian government, known as the Interim Government of National Unity, IGNU, led by Dr. Amos Sawyer, a prominent Doe opposition figure who had been living abroad in the U.S. He was elected by a delegation that represented various different Liberian interest groups and political parties. This government was internationally recognized and propped up by ECOMOG. The IMPFL under Johnson and the Liberian government army agreed to cooperate with IGNU and ECOMOG. However, Taylor did not. In response, Taylor set up his own administration, known as Greater Liberia, and he controlled 90% of the country, setting up his capital in Gabranga, which remained relatively stable for most of the conflict. However, this left Liberia in a strange position, with the internationally recognized government controlling Monrovia and not a whole lot else.
When I say confusion, everything out of control.
Charles Taylor was not exactly ecstatic with Liberia's new arrangement, and his prized goals, control of Monrovia, and international recognition as the head of Liberia, was still out of reach. He realized that ECOMOG's presence in the country severely hindered his ambitions. But he decided to bide his time until the moment was right to strike and consolidate control of Greater Liberia. From November 1990 to August 1992, a weak ceasefire was in place throughout Liberia, with occasional escalations and fighting taking place. Taylor's Greater Liberia during this time was relatively stable, albeit run like Taylor's personal fiefdom. There was the gate system, in which all roads in Greater Liberia had checkpoint gates, from which MPFL fighters controlled. From the gates, travelers could be stopped, interrogated, and looted. Taylor controlled business contracts with foreign organizations, handing them out in exchange for personal payments in US dollars, and he was able to make tens of millions off the territory's timber, rubber, and diamonds. He cultivated relations with influential people and leaders, such as local chiefs, allowing for easier integration of his subjects into his sphere by building upon traditional power structures. However, this is not to say that violence and problems were non-existent in Greater Liberia. Forced recruitment in the territory by the MPFL was common, including amongst children. Violence towards the civilian population also took place, with one gruesome example in Clay, Bomi County in September 1991 when the MPFL massacred what some estimates put up to possibly 300 civilians and burned property and destroyed houses. This was just one of the many examples of violence that took place. Also, during this time, unsettling rumors started to spring up about rituals being carried out in Taylor's Gabranga headquarters, including the consumption of human body parts. On the 23rd of March, 1991, one of Taylor's acquaintances, the Sierra Leonean Fode Sanko, who he had met back in Libya in 1988, launched his invasion of Sierra Leone from Liberia, with MPFL rebels also crossing over to provide support. Sanko's group was known as the Revolutionary United Front, or the RUF. The plan for the two groups' collaboration was simple. The RUF would take over the lucrative diamond mines in Sierra Leone, and in exchange for weapons, rebel fighters, and other support by Taylor. His involvement was so substantial that he would later be accused of organizing and directing operations for the RUF within Sierra Leone. In exchange for MPFL support, the RUF would give Taylor diamonds, as exporting items out of Sierra Leone was difficult due to inconsistent control of borders and ports, an issue which Taylor didn't have in his Greater Liberian territory, thus creating a joint criminal enterprise. This was a very beneficial arrangement for Taylor, who would be gaining valuable minerals that he could easily use as a hard currency for whatever he saw fit, and wouldn't have to worry about pesky sanctions. Taylor also supported this for personal reasons, as Taylor held a long-standing grudge against the then Sierra Leonean president at the time, Joseph Momo, for multiple reasons. Momo had refused to allow Taylor's MPFL to launch their invasion of Liberia via Sierra Leone back in 1989, with Momo refusing to meet with Taylor and later even deporting him to Côte d'Ivoire. When hostility broke out initially in Liberia, Momo allowed Mdou to station his troops in Sierra Leone to combat the MPFL. ECOMOG was also then later supported by Sierra Leone, with Nigerian bombers being stationed in the Sierra Leonean capital of Freetown, from which they were able to launch attacks against Taylor. This all made Taylor incensed, and he declared he would send war across the border. The RUF was able to seize a majority of the territory, land, and many of Sierra Leone's diamond mines as a poorly trained and ill-equipped government army was routed. One of the RUF's most brutal tactics it employed was the amputation of limbs, a practice for which it gained worldwide notoriety. Sierra Leone was plunged into a violent conflict that would last for 11 years, from 1991 to 2002, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 75,000 and plunging the country into anarchy. What happened during these years is far too complex and time-consuming to explain in this video. However, it is important to note that Charles Taylor played an important role in facilitating the conflict, which I will partially mention later on. In September of 1991, the recently formed United Liberation Movement of Liberia for Democracy, ULIMO, which consisted mostly of ex-army soldiers who fought for President Mdou, began engaging in small skirmishes with MPFL troops along the Sierra Leone-Liberian border, with some alleging that ULIMO received support from ECOMOG. Throughout all this, though, efforts to negotiate a settlement to the conflict were still taking place, though a major roadblock proved to be Charles Taylor, who was insistent on acquiring power. He also tended to make a spectacle out of negotiations, such as when during one meeting in the capital of Burkina Faso, Ouagadougou, he showed up in full military attire and had his bodyguards jog alongside his car from the airport to the city center. However, in October 1991, a breakthrough was made when ECOWAS negotiated a peace accord between all the major stakeholders meant to stop the fighting. Some elements of the agreement included ECOMOG would be recognized as a legitimate peacekeeping force, armed groups would be confined via camps and then disarmed via ECOMOG, and after this was done, elections would be hosted. As part of the deal, the MPFO wanted the ECOMOG peacekeeping force to change its composition to include more francophone countries, which was agreed upon, and 1,500 Senegalese troops were deployed. This will be important later. Progress was being made in Liberia, with roads reopening, a Supreme Court being appointed, and the University of Liberia reopening, with actions being taken to prepare for an election. In late April, after a series of positive meetings, Taylor finally agreed to have ECOMOG troops deployed to MPFL territory, allowing them to disarm factions and create an environment in which elections could be held. However, problems quickly arose when on May the 6th, Senegalese peacekeepers were captured and brutally executed after a battle with the MPFL. This led to ECOMOG troops withdrawing from some parts of the country and economic sanctions being placed upon Taylor's breakaway state. However, the final nail in the coffin for the fragile ceasefire came in August 1992, when ULEMO forces launched an invasion into parts of Liberia, routing the MPFL from areas and inflicting heavy casualties, officially ending the ceasefire. Taylor accused ECOMOG of supporting ULEMO, and all their troops were ordered to withdraw back to Monrovia. However, 580 ECOMOG peacekeepers stationed in small groups in remote areas of Greater Liberia were prevented from leaving, disarmed, and effectively held hostage by the MPFO. It wasn't until late September that they were able to return to Monrovia after Jimmy Carter intervened. Yes, that Jimmy Carter. However, on the way back to Monrovia, the ECOMOG peacekeepers were beaten, humiliated, and robbed. This shifted ECOMOG's sentiment towards the MPFL significantly, causing them to lose any remaining goodwill towards the MPFL and Taylor. On October 15th, the conflict took another turn, with the MPFL attacking Monrovia in what was called Operation Octopus, an offensive which was successfully repelled by the ECOMOG peacekeeping force. The fighting forced an approximate 200,000 refugees from suburban Monrovia into the city center in an effort to escape the fighting, which worsened the already apocalyptic conditions in the city. This increase in fighting also led to ECOMOG's role within the conflict to change and their forces to swell, eventually growing to be between 10,000 to 12,000 troops. No longer were they a peacekeeping force, but they became peace enforcing. And aggressive rules of engagement allowed them to use force if they felt threatened, disarm warring factions, and attack targets that posed a possible threat, meaning offensive action could be conducted. Bombing raids throughout the country conducted by ECOMOG resulted in civilian casualties. ECOMOG became closer with ULEMO and approved the rearmament of the Liberian government army. The UN also passed a resolution authorizing an arms embargo against Liberia to all parties except for ECOMOG. Liberia was rapidly descending back into anarchy as full-scale war broke out. By July of 1993, following intense fighting throughout the country, Taylor's Greater Liberia had shrunk by nearly 2/3. New groups, such as the previously inactive Liberian Peace Council, LPC, a crown-aligned ex-DOE loyalist subgroup of ULEMO consisting of many previous government soldiers, took up arms to launch numerous attacks against MPFL territory. Violence against civilians and war crimes were commonplace amongst all sides, Aid convoys carrying vital life-saving supplies would be attacked. Hospitals were bombed. And in one particularly infamous case, a displaced persons camp outside Harbour was attacked by the Liberian government army, resulting in the death of 547 civilians, most of which being women and children. That particular act brought about increased awareness towards the plight of Liberia, with the UN Security Council condemning the violence, and an independent inquiry being launched, headed by the Kenyan Attorney General at the time, who traveled to Liberia to investigate. A peace agreement was signed by the major armed groups on July the 25th following UN-sponsored talks known as the Cotonou Agreements. With the ceasefire set to begin on the 1st of August, a new transitional government was set to be created to replace the weakened Mdou. With the 5-person Council of State elected by the warring factions, primarily representing the old interim government, the MPFL, and ULEMO. The interim government would come to be known as the Liberian National Transitional Government, LNTG. Plans were made to host elections in September. The UN would even set up a mission to oversee Liberia, known as the UN Observer Mission in Liberia, UNOMIL, with its goal being to investigate violations of the ceasefire and report major human rights violations, amongst others. This agreement also controversially said it would provide amnesty for all persons and parties who had been involved in the conflict. And ECOMOG would bring in troops from outside of West Africa to help keep the peace via the Organization of African Unity, the precursor to the modern African Union. The LNTG was constituted in March 1994 and was backed by ECOMOG. They planned to organize elections for September of 1994. However, elections didn't happen, and fighting restarted as ULEMO split along ethnic lines into two groups. ULEMO J, which represented the Krans and was led by Roosevelt Johnson, no relation to Prince Johnson, and ULEMO K, which was representative of the Mandingos and led by Alhaji Kroma. UNOMIL's work would be seriously hindered by harassment and violence towards their observers, making it too dangerous for them to continue. The situation on the ground was worsening. Charles Taylor was losing support amongst his own faction, with major cabinet members leaving, and fighting was breaking out in the once semi-stable heartlands of Greater Liberian Territory. ECOMOG was only able to deploy to 15% of the country due to the situation. Along the borders, their presence was weak, allowing for arms to enter despite the embargo. The agreement would also have to be amended as the Liberian government army, which was still a powerful faction and was committing plenty of war crimes, got annoyed that they weren't one of the key players in the new LNTG. This meant that in early September, they signed an updated agreement that replaced Mdou with the Liberian government army as one of the three key parties in the LNTG. And because why not, on September the 15th, some ex-Liberian government army leadership attempted a coup in Monrovia, taking over administrative offices until they got arrested by ECOMOG. However, with all parties starting to weaken, a clear path to victory was not seeming possible for any of the sides, and mounting international pressure forced the major factions to convene for an ECOWAS-hosted summit in Abuja, Nigeria. On August 19, 1995, the Abuja Agreement was signed. It stated a nationwide ceasefire would start on the 26th of August. The LNTG was reformed, so it now had an expanded 6-person Council of State, meant to represent all of the major factions. In the case of ULEMO, which were now split along ethnic lines, ULEMO J and ULEMO K represented their own interests, whilst other smaller ULEMO sub-factions, such as the LPC, worked to form coalitions with other smaller groups. Progress was made as the groups elected the 6-person Council of State a day ahead of time on September the 1st, with various ministerial roles and governmental positions handed out. Charles Taylor was Speaker of Parliament, and the leader of the largest faction within the government. This allowed for him to promote his political interests substantially more than anyone else. Elections were set for the 20th of August 1996. Observers noted the ceasefire was being maintained, roads were reopening, and aid was being delivered. After 11 agreements for peace, seemingly, this was the one. Intermittent fighting was taking place between groups. Things were behind schedule. Disarmament and demobilization was not happening. Things looked like they were rapidly sliding back into all-out war. 727,000 Liberians had fled the country by this point, and repatriation did not look imminent. Things would take a turn for the worse, though, on April 6, 1996, when the National Police, supported by the MPFL and Ulimo K, attempted to arrest Ulimo J leader Roosevelt Johnson on murder charges issued by the LNTG in Monrovia. This plunged the city back into full-scale war as Roosevelt Johnson evaded capture. The violence displaced half of the 1.3 million inhabitants of the city, and looting was widespread. ECOWAS negotiations resulted in a ceasefire being reinstated on May 26. By the end of the month, a majority of MPFL and Ulimo K fighters had left the city, with some Ulimo J and LPC fighters even disarming via ECOMOG. In September, the LNTG reconvened for the first time since April and also elected Ruth Perry as the head of the council, making her the first woman head of state in Africa. Renewed effort was made by each of the groups to enact the agreements outlined in the Abuja Accords, with numerous committees established, as well as expanding monitoring and adjusting the timetable for the elections and disarmament to more fit the current situation. ECOMOG and UNOMO were deployed throughout the country to help in the disarmament process, with resources being provided to demobilized fighters to try to assist in their transition back to civilian life. Election Day was set for May 30th, 1997, with preparations for the event underway, with various groups and organizations working to provide support. Taylor created the National Patriotic Party to serve as the political wing representing the MPFL at the upcoming elections. He also resigned from his roles within the LNTG, appointing a loyalist in his place in accordance with the rules surrounding eligibility to run in the upcoming election. However, that December, a rumor was sweeping through Liberia at an astonishing rate of a great darkness approaching that would engulf the nation in a violence significantly worse than had ever been seen, and people were convinced. The rumor was deemed credible enough to where on December 7th, ECOMOG troops were placed on the highest level of alert due to fear of the upcoming apocalypse. But, in one of the most bizarre parts of Liberian history, Charles Taylor, hearing this, decided that it would be his perfect opportunity to reach the masses. He got some Christmas lights, a Christmas tree, a power strip, and gathered the press at an important location in Monrovia. Taylor plugged in the lights, lighting up the tree, and declared the darkness gone, to which people believed him. The story was spread all throughout the nation, and Taylor was widely praised for his actions, having saved Liberia, with his supernatural powers greatly improving credibility. Things were going well in Liberia. By the end of the disarmament period, which lasted from November 22, 1996 to February 9, 1997, an estimated 33,000 fighters had been disarmed, including over 4,000 child soldiers. 9,750 weapons and 1.2 million pieces of ammunition were surrendered to the authorities. However, pockets of resistance outside of the authorities' reach still remained. The numbers of Liberian refugees outside of the country had swelled to over 1 million, and they began returning home in droves. The election was delayed by a month to July 14th due to delays in preparation. Taylor began campaigning for the presidency, and so did his rivals. However, Taylor's campaigning was unmatched by his political rivals for a few reasons. Liberian media was sparse, with with little distribution of newspapers and televisions being only in Monrovia, and extremely rare at that. Therefore, a majority of the country relied on radio stations for their news, something which benefited Taylor greatly. The two dominant stations in the country were Radio Liberia International and Kiss FM. The latter was owned and operated by Taylor. Kiss FM was the only option in many parts of the country, and also the only station that was playing day and night. Taylor was able to effectively control the media with his intended narrative, which helped boost his popularity massively. Broadcasts such as these were played constantly in the build-up to the elections, advertising Taylor.
I saw every man in Fort NPP, His Excellency Charles Kyenkyen. Respect every man. Oh no!
Come election 97, who's going to take charge of that one chair?
At the end of it all, it requires that kind of leader.
Taylor's financial power was unmatched by any of his opponents. Having plundered much of Liberia for the past few years, Taylor could afford to splash the cash. At rallies, he distributed bags of rice to the audience. He created a charity through which he helped people affected by the war. He also helped to charter a flight for the Liberian national soccer team to play a game in Togo. These stunts helped massively boost his popularity and were only possible through his great wealth. Taylor was able to establish broader appeal and presence. He was able to visit more areas of the country, and through his carefully crafted persona, he was able to attract many groups. There was also a fear that if Taylor lost, violence would restart. Billboards appeared saying, "No Gonki, no peace," and rumors of the MPFL only handing over their damaged weapons appeared. Election day rolled around, and in elections that were certified to be free and fair, Charles Taylor won a massive majority of the vote, 75.3%, with his closest rival, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, winning just under 10% of the vote, making him president of Liberia. His MPP won a majority in the House and the Senate. This was a surprise to much of the international community, who had been horrified upon hearing stories of Taylor's young supporters chanting, "He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I'll still vote for him." However, many Liberians didn't vote along ideological lines, but rather upon a logical conclusion of who would provide the greatest chance of allowing them to rebuild their lives and have peace. Fearing if Taylor lost, they would be right back to square one, with violence restarting, the choice was easy. Taylor had finally done it. He'd rose to the top of the Liberian government, and on August 2nd, he was officially inaugurated as president of Liberia, beginning his 6-year term. And with that, the first Liberian Civil War had finished, and 200,000 had died, and over 1 million had fled the country. But Charles Taylor was president. Upon becoming president, Taylor began his campaign of national reconciliation, offering cabinet positions to political rivals and opponents, such as Roosevelt Johnson. Taylor also took the time to have the executive mansion ritually purified and consecrated by various Christian ministers and priests. However, the honeymoon period was soon short-lived, and shortly after being elected, there was a series of murders of political opponents and once rivals of Taylor. The country was also financially hurting, with massive debts and a limited budget. Only 17,000 USD was in the nation's reserves when Taylor became president. They could not look for external assistance due to the current government's ongoing connections to the war in Sierra Leone. Little was spent on developing infrastructure and bettering the lives of the average Liberian, as Taylor decided he would squeeze out whatever profits possible from his newfound power by taking cuts from government revenue and using his position to further his own business interests. He also had to deal with the newly unemployed rebels that filled the country. So he decided to set up 2 paramilitary forces. the Anti-Terrorist Unit, ATU, headed by his American-born son, Chucky Taylor, and the Special Security Services, SSS. The former served multiple roles, including helping to train rebels from Sierra Leone, facilitating the smuggling of blood diamonds, and acting as a quick reaction force, with Taylor's son committing and ordering many brutal acts of violence. The latter acting like a presidential force mixed with the KGB, both of which were paid for by Taylor himself out of pocket and were not on the government payroll, and would come to be known for their brutality and disregard for human life. Taylor would also be isolating himself from the global community. Following the war in Sierra Leone restarting in 1999 and Taylor's continued role in facilitating the conflict, he would be sanctioned by the US and face increasing scrutiny from the UN, who would accuse him of being a gun runner and a diamond smuggler. In response, Charles Taylor, who is a lay preacher for the Baptist Church, organized a mass prayer. Clothing himself in all white, he prostrated himself and begged the Lord for forgiveness, all whilst denying the charges.
Brothers and sisters, lend me your ears.
The first major cracks in the Taylor regime's stability had appeared on September 18, 1998, when Liberian government forces tried to arrest Ulemo J leader Roosevelt Johnson. In a scene similar to what had happened 2 years ago, clashes broke out between the groups, and eventually Roosevelt Johnson had to flee to the U.S. Embassy in Monrovia. The clashes would result in 50 dead and Johnson being evacuated to Ghana a week later, after the U.S. refused to hand him over, knowing he wouldn't receive a fair trial. The political oppression, economic mismanagement, and state-sponsored violence gave way for the formation of Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, LORD, a rebel group founded by Sekou Kone in 1999, primarily consisting of Krans and Mandingos, who had long been fighting against Taylor under the banner of Ulemo K and Ulemo J. Kone stated that their ambitions were to remove Taylor from power and that they would hand back control of all territory and assets seized during the insurrection once he was removed from power. LORD would make its first significant movement into Liberian territory via Guinea in April 2000, moving into Lofa County and gaining ground. In September of 2000, the RUF would attack Guinea, using Sierra Leonean territorial claims of the Parrot's Beak region as justification. The incursion would cause severe destruction and loss of life, angering the Guinean president, Lansana Conté. Knowing that Taylor helped provide much of the support to the RUF, he decided he would ramp up support to the LORD in retaliation, helping to train LORD forces, provide weapons, and other support. The Sierra Leonean government would also work to provide support to LORD, knowing that if they were able to put enough pressure on Taylor's government, it could weaken the RUF back home. Importantly, neither the government of Sierra Leone nor Guinea had arms embargoes, unlike Liberia, meaning the material support provided to LORD gave them a massive edge against Taylor's army, who were being beaten back. Taylor, having downsized the Liberian government army to consolidate power, had to rely on former MPFL fighters, including many child soldiers under the influence of drugs, guided by Chucky's ATU. Both sides committed atrocities as fighting raged throughout the country, leaving waves of destruction behind them. With many LORD fighters using their newfound power to enact revenge and avenge personal grievances. They, like other rebel groups, also employed child soldiers, recruiting many of their fighters from refugee camps in neighboring countries. The U.S., interestingly, also provided indirect support to LORD. The U.S. military helped to train the Guinean soldiers, who would then go on to train LORD rebels. One of the major reasons for this was due to the diamonds brought into Liberia from Sierra Leone being linked to global terrorism. Al-Qaeda operatives had bought diamonds in Liberia since 1999 whilst being escorted around the country by Taylor's government, who helped to facilitate the deals. Some operatives even ended up meeting Taylor personally at his residence. Taylor ended up hiding al-Qaeda operatives in Liberia who were on the FBI's most wanted list post 9/11 in exchange for $1 million. In January 2002, the civil war had ceased in Sierra Leone, with the government and the UN establishing the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Prosecutors quickly worked to gather evidence against Taylor for his role in the conflict. In May 2002, the UN approved a series of extensive sanctions against Liberia, prohibiting diamond sales, sanctioning the government's major sources of revenue, continuing the arms embargo, and expanding travel restrictions. This continued to damage the government's already weakened ability to counter the rebels, with the few resources that were available going to military spending and not to the needs of the public. Increasing international calls were being made for Taylor to step down, especially by Britain, who were providing support to the government of Sierra Leone as both were members of the Commonwealth, the United States, with its close ties to Liberia, disliking his destabilizing presence for the country and his ties to al-Qaeda, and especially many of the countries neighboring to Liberia due to his affinity for destabilizing them. Taylor's woes would only increase in early 2003 after Cote d'Ivoire provided support for a newly formed Lord Allied rebel group called Movement for Democracy in Liberia, Mdou, after Taylor had refused to provide support for the Ivorian government in the civil war that was taking place there. Mdou was able to capture large parts of South Liberia quickly, leaving death and destruction in their wake. By mid-2003, in a scene reminiscent of September of 1990, Taylor was holed up in Monrovia, with rebels controlling 70% of the country and 50% of the population having fled to Monrovia. On June 4, 2003, Taylor would receive perhaps his biggest blow to date, an indictment by the UN-sponsored Special Court for Sierra Leone on 17 counts of war crimes, and an international arrest warrant was unsealed. This all happened whilst he was at negotiations in Accra, Ghana, meant to try to find a solution to the conflict. Despite international pressure, the Ghanaian government didn't arrest Taylor and let him return to Liberia that same day. Taylor's attendance at the peace negotiations is a story in itself that is worth sharing. In 2002, Lima Boy organized several hundred Christian women in Monrovia across various congregations and denominations and began protesting for peace. Asatu Ba Kenneth, a Muslim police officer, joined the movement and helped to unite the Muslim and Christian women in Liberia into one joint movement known as the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace, WLAMP, which was headed by Boe. The organization pressured religious leaders into pressuring the self-professed religious warlords into working for peace. The organization continued to protest for peace despite threats of violence by Taylor himself. Over 1,000 women gathered demanding to meet with Taylor, who relented, and on April 23rd, Boe presented WLAMP's statement demanding Taylor attend peace talks in Ghana, to which he agreed. Kenneth and other WLAMP representatives went to Sierra Leone, where Lord leaders were meeting, and demanded that they attend the same peace talks in Ghana, to which they also agreed. At the peace talks in Ghana, WLAMP representatives attended and continued to pressure the parties into agreeing to peace, going so far as to conduct a sit-in at one of the buildings where the negotiations were taking place, blocking the exits to prevent the representatives of the warring factions from leaving until they reached an agreement. When threatened with arrests and being forcibly moved, Boe threatened to strip naked in front of them, which is considered to be a terrible curse in Liberian culture. Their actions meant that peace talks continued, despite serious violence restarting on the ground, and for serious dialogue to occur amongst the warring parties. The actions of the WLAMP in bringing the parties to negotiate and forcing a continuation of negotiations would go on to prove vital. The next day, Lord launched its first of 3 attempts to capture Monrovia. Approaching from the northwest after 3 days of heavy fighting, they were beaten back. On June 17th, A short-lived ceasefire was agreed to by all parties, but Taylor quickly began backtracking, and the agreement would collapse. On June 23rd, Lord would regroup for a second attempt. This time, they would penetrate deeper into the city until they were forced to retreat due to running out of ammo after heavy fighting. The ATU and SSS were mainly responsible for the defense of Monrovia, with looting and destruction being widespread. On July 5th, Taylor said he would accept an offer for asylum via Nigeria's president, Olusegun Obasanjo. However, he did not specify when he would leave. The U.S. administration of George W. Bush, who had become sick of Taylor's delay tactics, diverted the aircraft carrier USS Kearsarge, which had 1,800 Marines on board, as a show of force against Taylor. The African Union, which developed a reputation for not taking a stand against Taylor, would even come out and join the U.S. in demanding Taylor's resignation. On July 18th, Lord began their third and final offensive on Monrovia. The fighting in this was so brutal and intense that it would come to be known as World War III amongst Monrovia residents. The conditions for civilians within the city, which was already extremely poor before the start of the Second Civil War, with the power and water not being reconnected to the city in the 6 years that Taylor had been in charge, only got worse as the armed groups looted and destroyed the city in the fighting. Many civilians were killed, being specifically targeted by the groups or as a result of fighting, with poorly aimed mortars and artillery resulting in many casualties amongst civilians. Taylor's men were running out of ammo, and the writing was on the wall. The longer he stayed in Monrovia, the higher the chances of him meeting a grisly end like his old enemy, Mdou. An international peacekeeping force being deployed to Liberia was only to be sent if Taylor were to resign. Taylor agreed, but he wanted to make one last spectacle as president of Liberia. On August 11th, Charles Taylor handed over power to his vice president, albeit nearly 3 hours behind schedule, due to him having to greet the 3 different African heads of state who he had convinced to fly in to watch the ceremony. Taylor closed his remarks by saying, "I can no longer see you suffering. The suffering is enough. God willing, I will be back." And with that, he flew off to Nigeria. The guns of Liberia lay dormant, and the war would come to a close with the peace agreement being signed between all parties in Accra, Ghana on the 18th of August, bringing the Second Liberian Civil War to a close, and with peacekeepers being deployed to stabilize the situation. Statistics specifically pertaining to the Second Civil War can be hard to find, but we can estimate the death toll to be somewhere around 50,000, as combined estimates put the death toll for the First and Second Liberian Civil War to be at 250,000, where specific estimates for the First Civil War put the death toll to be at 200,000, therefore meaning the Second Civil War likely had a death toll of around 50,000. With the conflict ending, Liberia could now work towards rebuilding and reconciliation. Taylor lived in a compound of 3 heavily guarded hilltop villas in Calabar, Nigeria, and contrary to the rules of his asylum agreement, he was still involving himself in Liberian politics and managing his businesses, trying to find a route for a possible comeback. This included having his ex-wife, Jewel Howard Taylor, who was still politically loyal to Taylor, elected to the Liberian Senate in 2005. However, people wanted Taylor to face a judge for what he had done. In November of 2003, the U.S. offered a $2 million reward for Taylor's arrest and threatened to cut off aid to Nigeria if he wasn't handed over. In December, Interpol issued a red notice, an arrest warrant, for the arrest of Charles Taylor and added him to their most wanted list. Though the Nigerian government refused to hand over Taylor, stating that they were concerned that his handover could result in unrest, a similar sentiment echoed by Liberia's transitional government, with Nigeria also refusing to hand him over until a democratically elected Liberian leader requested Taylor to be extradited. In 2005, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who you may remember ran against Taylor in 1997, won the democratic elections in Liberia, and in March of 2006, she requested Taylor to be handed over to Liberian authorities so they could hand him over to the UN. However, 2 days after the announcement being made by the Nigerian government that they would hand him over, in one last desperate attempt at freedom, Taylor escaped custody. This all happened as Obasanjo was going to meet George W. Bush in Washington, D.C., causing a major diplomatic embarrassment. Disguised in a diplomatic car and with sacks of cash on him, Taylor was found and arrested, trying to cross the Nigerian-Cameroonian border. On the 29th of March, Taylor was flown to Monrovia, where upon arriving at the airport, he was handed over to UN peacekeepers and a bailiff for the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Later that day, he arrived in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and was taken to prison. Importantly, all of what Taylor is being accused of and being put on trial for was in regards to his role in crimes committed in Sierra Leone after November 30th, 1996, and his facilitation of the conflict, meaning none of his actions in Liberia were being put to trial. In April 2006, Taylor pleaded not guilty to 11 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, down by 6 from the original 17 he was indicted on. In June, his trial was moved to the Netherlands, believing that his presence in Sierra Leone was destabilizing and a threat to the peace, with the UK agreeing to jail Taylor if convicted. Eventually, in June of 2007, the trial got underway, and Taylor, showman as ever, fired his legal team, demanded a new one, and boycotted the initial proceedings, claiming that he was not ensured a fair trial. Taylor's new defense got the trial delayed until January 2008, when the prosecution began making their argument. They sought to prove that Taylor, in his multiple roles of leadership and levels of involvement in the conflict in Sierra Leone, planned, instigated, and ordered crimes or failed to prevent them despite knowledge of crimes being committed. They brought in over 94 witnesses to testify live over the next few years. Taylor's defense would claim that whilst terrible things did happen in Sierra Leone, he did not play a role. The prosecution closed their arguments in early 2009, with the defense beginning theirs in July 2009. Taylor's legal team sought to prove that the trial had no legitimacy, highlighting how one of the main supporters of Charles Taylor's extradition, the United States, didn't even recognize the ICC, whilst also working to try to disprove his role in the conflict, even having Charles Taylor testify in his own defense. The defense would rest their case in November 2010. Final arguments would take place in March of 2011. However, the trial was not without eventfulness. Some notable moments include a former bodyguard for Taylor having to go into hiding after threats of violence following his testimony regarding Taylor's smuggling arms into Sierra Leone, as well as cash and other resources for a militia. British model Naomi Campbell testifying about receiving blood diamonds from Charles Taylor after a 1997 dinner hosted by Nelson Mandela in South Africa. Taylor converting to Judaism, because why not, but also deciding to follow Christianity at the same time. Taylor's third wife had her third baby from prison in early 2010, leading to the child to be called a miracle baby in Liberia, because people couldn't conceive how prison was permissible for baby making. Taylor was accused of many horrendous acts during the trial, including forcing his soldiers to partake in cannibalism, as well as partaking himself, overseeing the deployment of child soldiers, among other heinous acts. On April 26, 2012, 6 years after Taylor was first arrested, he was found guilty on all 11 accounts, which were acts of terrorism, murder, violence to life, health, and physical or mental well-being of a person, in particular murder, rape, sexual slavery and any other form of sexual violence, outrages upon personal dignity, violence to life, health, and physical or mental well-beings, in particular to cruel treatment, other inhumane acts, conscripting or enlisting children under the age of 15 years into armed forces or groups, or using them to participate actively in hostilities, enslavement, and pillaging. This combined to 5 war crimes, 5 crimes against humanity, and 1 serious violation of international humanitarian law. The court had ruled that Taylor had aided the RUF and helped facilitate many of their crimes. With the guilty verdict, Charles Taylor would become the first head of state to be found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity by international tribunal since the Nuremberg trials. On May 30th, Taylor would be sentenced to 50 years in prison, minus time already spent. He would be transferred to prison in England, where he still is to this day, and where he will almost certainly remain until his death. It is ironic for all the years of pain and suffering Charles Taylor inflicted upon Liberians, he was found guilty of crimes relating to Sierra Leone, a country which he primarily used to facilitate many of the things he did in Liberia. Solace can be found in the fact that Liberia has remained mostly peaceful since the ending of the Second Civil War, and in 2024, Liberia had a new president sworn in following the 2023 elections, which were widely praised. That marked the second back-to-back peaceful transition of power in democratic elections in the country, though the scars of decades of violence still remain. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Tilley, who had moved to the United States and changed his name to Moses Thomas at the end of the war, was found guilty for the massacre of civilians at the St. Peter's Lutheran Church massacre in a U.S. court in 2021. He fled to Liberia to avoid justice in 2019, where he lives free to this day. Chucky Taylor was found guilty of torture and conspiracy to commit torture in the United States in 2008. He was sentenced to 97 years in prison in 2009, which he is currently serving in Florida. Jewel Howard Taylor would be elected vice president of Liberia in 2017 on George Weah's ticket. She and Waugh would lose their bid for re-election in the 2023 presidential elections. Fode Sanko would die in prison in 2003 whilst awaiting trial by the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf would remain in charge of Liberia up until 2018, having been re-elected in 2011. She was one of the co-recipients of the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize for her work in nonviolent struggle for the safety of women and for women's rights to full participation in peacebuilding work. Prince Johnson would be elected to the Liberian Senate in 2005, a position for which he held until his death in 2024. Lima Boye would also be one of the co-recipients of the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize for her work. She would go on to found the Boye Peace Foundation. Hey y'all, sorry it took so long for the video to be released. Hopefully I should be getting back to more consistent scheduled videos soon. I think the next topic should be pretty interesting. But if y'all did enjoy this piece, I hope y'all like and subscribe and have a great day.